Episode 2, Richard the Lionheart, Saladin, the Third Crusade, and finding an unlikely mutual respect upon the ideological battleground. War is undoubtedly terrible. However, when war is waged specifically along ideological lines, some of the very worst cruelties seem to nearly always follow in turn. When we successfully dehumanize an adversary, our capacity to inflict the very worst upon them is unlocked. And when religious fervor and zealotry enter the mix, restraint and common ground feel even less likely to be found. This has essentially been true throughout all human history, and as we sadly see in our modern news cycle, it's a wretched reality that lives with us still in the present. Given this likelihood of encouraging the worst of the possible depravities humanity could direct against itself, it would seem unlikely that any notable example of better conduct in such a conflict could exist in the historical record. Less probable still is that such an example was laid before us as far back as the 12th century. It isn't hard to find mankind invalidating its neighbors even today over lines of religious antagonism. Othering and even committing acts of considerable hatred become more palatable when they're in theory sanctioned and correct. So just how is it that some 800 years ago, two leaders from competing, militantly antagonistic, totally opposed spheres of global influence saw not just the basic humanity in one another, but even a respected rival? How did two men engaged in a seemingly apocalyptic, zero-sum game of a contest approach negotiations with not only cunning, but a rational sense of realism, refreshingly centered on accomplishing the sensibly possible instead of dying for greedy ambitions well out of reach? The Crusades are nearly a byword for mindlessly violent zealotry, well beyond the niceties and constraints of our modern notions of humanism, diplomacy, and rational war waged within internationally sanctioned, clearly defined bounds. Yet today our world leaders, when tainted with similarly irrational ideological rhetoric, rarely break bread and conduct themselves in a manner becoming of history's truly great heads of state. So today, we explore just such a dynamic out of history, from a time of frontline serving warrior kings, as martial as they were political, and we investigate both our main focus of the Third Crusade and also the preceding events that laid its groundwork. The age of crusading dawned in the early 11th century, but its perceived necessity didn't develop in a vacuum. The geopolitical realities of the era set the stage for the lengthy period of intermittent religious warfare kicked off in 1096 with the First Crusade, and 7 additional major crusades would follow over the next nearly 200 years. Most crusades were fought between the Christian Latin West and the Muslim world, but targets occasionally included other Christians, such as the Eastern Greek Orthodox Byzantine Empire, and on other occasions simply focused on converting or destroying holdout groups of European pagans. Control over holy sites served as a frequent focal point for these conflicts, but that format of holy war was by no means ubiquitous. The cultural, political, and religious landscape of the age lent itself particularly naturally to far-reaching war. Christianity was significantly fragmented at this time. In the West, religion centered around the typically Roman but not always papacy, and the geopolitical realm was comprised of sometimes allied, very often rival states, collectively known as the Latin West, or simply the Franks to their Muslim adversaries. In the East existed a religious realm of Greek orthodoxy, politically centered around the Byzantine capital of Constantinople. The Muslim world had spent much of the last several centuries expanding, more often than not aggressively, increasingly threatening the Christian world's own notions of preeminence. Thusly, a paramount objective of seizing back Muslim-acquired territories, chiefly among these the Holy Land itself, spurred the earliest appeals for crusade. The redemption and expiation of sin accompanying the Crusaders' taking of the cross would very quickly become a potent driver of recruitment as well. In 1095, threatened cataclysmically by powerful Seljuk Turks, Byzantine Emperor Alexius I reached the peak of desperation necessary to formally request assistance from the Christian West. Eastern Orthodox Christianity and its Western Latin opposite were far from on stellar terms. Surviving the fall of the Western Roman Empire with far more grace and civility than the less developed regions of the West, the Byzantines ruled in considerable splendor from their capital Constantinople, a source of great jealousy for the Latins that would one day soon result in an incredibly bloody retribution. Viewing the Western Christians, not entirely inaccurately, as uncouth brutes, the Byzantines were seen in turn as haughty, arrogant, and weak, spoiled by luxury and ease. The considerable divergence in their respective practices of Christian worship only further drove a wedge between them. Such scruples couldn't be truly brought to bear now, however. The Eastern Christians had called for military relief, and the Crusades had begun in earnest. Also in 1095, back to the west, Pope Urban II called the Council of Clermont, held in France, which formally appealed to the Christian West to rise up and retake the Holy Land from Muslim influence, as well as come to the relief of beleaguered momentary ally Byzantium, properly initiating the First Crusade. Though driven by undeniable fervor and passion, and no small amount of violent zealotry, the Latin Crusaders began this grand undertaking rather inauspiciously, first with the utter annihilation of a crusading army too foolhardy to await reinforcements before engaging, and next with a practice that was to become tragically commonplace in the waging of holy war, the wholesale massacre of innocent Jewish communities, non-combatants to be stressed. In spite of making much of a menace of themselves, and going to no lengths to beat the allegations of barbarism leveled against them, conjoined Christian armies did succeed in capturing Nicaea, the Anatolian capital of the Seljuk Turks, located in present-day Turkey, followed by the significant Syrian city of Antioch. The grand culmination, however, was of course their sack and capture of Jerusalem, the diamond in the Holy Land's bejeweled crown, achieved in 1099. Jerusalem, at the time of its fall, was under the Egyptian Fatimids, Shiite Muslims at odds with the Sunni Seljuk Turks. With the city taken, a promise of protection for the civilian population was agreed to, but no such terms were honored, and the slaughter of the innocent residents of Jerusalem, men, women, and children, was appalling. Once more, the Jewish community fared particularly badly, amidst scenes of mass murder and pillage. Keep this example of Jerusalem's conquest in mind, as it will contrast strongly with other events soon to come. In the wake of Jerusalem's conquest, 4 Crusader states were established in the Holy Land to effectively govern the territories seized, and to maintain a base level of self-defense, as their crusading vows having been fulfilled, most Latin Christians returned home to the west to resume their lives. Investing heavily in vast defensive fortifications, chief among these castles, the 4 Crusader states of Jerusalem, Edessa, Antioch, and Tripoli, aided by the newly prominent military orders established during the Crusade, such as the Knights Hospitallers and the Templars, achieved some measure of temporary stability in the region, but this was not to last. A resurgent Islam, arrayed under new Seljuk military leaders, had decided the new status quo in the Holy Land was very much untenable, and a jihad was called to oust the Latins, or again, to use Muslim parlance of the period, the Franks, as well as to retake the Holy Land for Islam. The Crusader state of Edessa was the first to fall in 1144 to the capable, rising Seljuk general Zengi. Shocked by this sudden loss, the Christian West once more called for a crusade to rectify their setbacks, and this second crusade would embark for the east in 1147, under the joint leadership of King Louis VII of France and King Conrad of Germany. The primary takeaway from this episode is that the Crusaders tried and failed to capture Damascus in Syria, which is especially significant because it provided a sea change in Islam that would shape the conflict to come. The besieged Muslim forces in Damascus were forced to call upon the aid of the Seljuk successor to the previously mentioned warlord Zengi, this being a man named Nur ad-Din. With his foot now firmly in the door, Nur ad-Din would control Damascus by 1154. Nur ad-Din relied heavily upon his commander, General Shurka, to drive the Crusaders fully out of Egypt, with the general excelling in his task sufficiently to be promoted to governance of the whole region by 1169. Most outstanding of his bloodline, his exceptionally competent nephew Saladin would inherit these recently bestowed reins of power from his uncle later that same year. While acknowledging ultimate fealty to Nur ad-Din, Saladin chafed somewhat under the arrangement, opting to cherry-pick the battles he participated in and to operate under some degree of assumed autonomy. Nur ad-Din heavily pressured Saladin to abolish the Shia Caliphate, an entrenched Egyptian institution of relatively long standing and a valuable source of legitimate authority for Saladin's rule. Saladin initially resisted, but would eventually acquiesce in 1171, dissolving the Fatimid Caliphate and founding a new dynasty, the Ayyubid Sultanate, that same year. Perhaps the greatest change brought about by the founding of the Ayyubid Sultanate was the sectarian makeover the region of Egypt received. Formerly the historic Shia heartland, Cairo now became a bastion of Sunni power. By successfully controlling the territory of the Hijaz, Saladin now also controlled both Mecca and Medina, becoming the first man so distinguished to wear the title custodian of the two mosques. Beginning to lose faith in the purported loyalty of his subordinate, Nur ad-Din hatched plans to depose Saladin and seize Egypt from under him, but pivotally died in 1174 of a fever stemming from an infection before his scheme could be executed. Following a brief but messy power struggle in the vacuum left by the passing of his former master, Saladin at last fully held the reins of power by 1185, now uniting Egypt and Syria, and bringing many would-be independent cities in rebellion to heel. The Second Crusade and its failure may have briefly resulted in a fractured and infighting Muslim East, but this did not last. and though not without ongoing fractures and splits, Saladin's dynasty would be a fast-ascending, formidable power to safeguard the Muslim interests in the region. A dynamic force, Saladin now brought his significantly united Islam to bear against the remaining Crusader states, successfully retaking Jerusalem in 1187 after a week and a half of siege. Perhaps now recall that earlier account of the Christian taking and sacking of Jerusalem, as the contrast on display here is striking. Saladin approached his victory with a comparatively diplomatic and far-sighted vision. Unchecked, retributive violence didn't occur. Churches would remain open, and no disincentives would be given to Christians to continue their pilgrimages to the city's holy sites, for a visitation fee. In what can only be guessed at as a public relations appeal, some Christian sects previously maligned under Crusader rule, such as the Abyssinians and the Copts, were allowed free access going forward. Many Crusader refugees were allowed to return to their lands, provided they could pay for their own effective ransom, an exit fee, and those that could not were sold into slavery en masse. Perhaps the disparity between the Christian taking of Jerusalem and its Muslim counterpart is marginally overstated and romanticized, slightly past the line of good, objective historical taste. That said, the differences speak for themselves, and the conduct displayed here by Saladin would not in any respect be misrepresentative or a fluke. The first indications of a slightly more noble, elevated conduct to holy war were already being made manifest, and they would not only continue throughout this period, but begin in many respects to be matched by a Latin practitioner as well. The Lionheart's entry upon the Crusade's main stage was fast approaching. Calamitous as the loss of Jerusalem was for the Latins, other such decisive losses befell the Crusaders in that year of 1187. In July, a few short months prior to Jerusalem's siege, on a site in present-day Israel, the Battle of Hattin saw another crushing blow leveled against the forces of Christianity. The Crusader court of Guy of Lusignan, king of Jerusalem, had made a mutually advantageous deal with Saladin, effectively ensuring a temporary peace between Christians and Muslims, while Saladin dealt with pressing military matters against fellow Muslim adversaries. Reynald of Chatillon, an ambitious, headstrong prince of Antioch, and fellow member of King Guy's court, broke this truce by attacking a Muslim caravan, naturally sparking Saladin's anger. This breach led to both the Battle of Cresson and the aforementioned Battle of Hattin, both humiliating Crusader losses, the latter resulting in the capture, with the expected eventual ransoming, of many Crusader figures and Christian royalty of the region, as well as the Crusaders' loss of the relic of the True Cross. The true value of this relic to the Christians would appear to modern sensibilities as somewhat puzzling and inconsistent. While it would spur a retaliatory response in the near term, Richard the Lionheart would never actually raise the issue of the relic during eventual peace deliberations with Saladin to conclude the crusade, and it would remain with the Muslims. I had prior established this episode as very much being one centered on chronicling two standout personalities, a magnified focus on two rivals, above the din of the broader history of the Crusades themselves. I can finally begin to make good on that premise, as our first real opportunity to analyze the actions of one of our joint, opposed protagonists now comes to us via Saladin's conduct following the Battle of Hattin. Captured and assembled to be ransomed, in keeping with custom, Crusader notables Guy of Lusignan and Reynald of Chatillon were brought to Saladin's personal tent. Saladin invited King Guy to sit down beside him, with Reynald following and seating himself of his own volition next to his king. Saladin took the opportunity to chastise Reynald, recall that it was his foolhardy aggression that broke the truce and brought about the Battle of Hattin, questioning of him how many oaths and signed agreements he had disregarded and violated. Through a translator, Reynald audaciously replied, "Kings have always acted thus. I did nothing more." As this played out, it was plainly evident that King Guy was agonized with thirst. Saladin arranged for cool water to be brought for him, an offer he graciously accepted. Guy drank his fill, handing the remainder to Reynald, who in turn drank to quench his own by now great thirst. Turning to Guy, Saladin now informed him that as he did not ask permission before sharing the water with Reynald, he was under no obligation to grant the man mercy. Reynald would swiftly be beheaded and made a show of before King Guy, now utterly terrified. Saladin, for his part, now merely replied reassuringly, "It is not the wont of kings to kill kings, but that man had transgressed all bounds, and therefore did I treat him thus. This man was killed only because of his maleficence and perfidy." This incident very neatly demonstrates an important character aspect of Saladin, as well as, to a point, Richard the Lionheart, as we will soon see. Protocol and proper adherence to customary etiquette would loom large in Saladin's rationalizations throughout this conflict. He would observe proper conduct with unexpected dedication, given the all-or-nothing nature his era's holy wars present as to us now. but transgress in that proper exercise of conduct, and the absolutist brutality more expected from powerful men of this era was sure to follow. It seems nearly quaint to consider a chivalrous code of ethics governing ideological holy war, with the enemy sinners before God to be eradicated, and such conflicts of our own era resembling far more impersonal acts of terror and counter-terror, often equal parts indiscriminate. Yet such was the status quo here. In the wake of Jerusalem's fall to Saladin's forces, Pope Gregory VIII issued a crusade bull, inciting Latin Christendom to go and recapture the city, in addition to other fallen Crusader territories. Conrad of Montferrat, no friend of King Guise and a denier of said king's sovereignty, landed at Tyre with a small force of Italians, engaging Saladin. Tensions among the Crusaders were high, and the recently ransomed King Guy himself broke the terms of his agreed parole with Saladin by leading an army in siege of Acre. The Latins had little to show for the siege by early 1191, however. In response to Gregory's bull, a religiously fired coalition of Western Christian rulers, led by King Philip II of France, German Emperor Frederick Barbarossa, and, at last, King Richard I of England, would now set out to retake the Holy Land. Emperor Barbarossa would mysteriously drown in a river en route to the Holy Land, having achieved a few preliminary field victories as he had progressed. Much of his grieving contingent would now return home, never having reached the battlefields of the Middle East. Perhaps contrary to our preconceptions, given the trajectory of the 20th century, Germany was not a hub of anti-Semitism at this time, and in fact, Emperor Barbarossa put measures in place to protect the Jews of his realm. Enacting a moderate tax on the Jews to assist in funding the crusade, Barbarossa then placed the Jews under his protection, forbidding anyone to preach against them. The First and Second Crusades had been stained with violent anti-Semitic incitements, and through these proactive measures, Barbarossa prevented such a repeat in his own lands, the same of which could not be said of England of this time. Richard and Philip II departed for the Holy Land closely to one another, having both set sail in July of 1190. They left in such a fashion due to a severe, well-founded mutual mistrust of one another, each suspecting the other to get up to territorial mischief in their absence. The greatest root of their antipathy surrounded feuding over the region of Normandy. Arriving on Cyprus and being foolishly attacked by the island's Byzantine ruler Isaac Comnenus, Richard handily turned the tables and captured the island for Latin Christendom, with it remaining in Frankish hands for several centuries and being of use to the Crusader war efforts. Finally arriving on the scene and throwing himself into the siege of Acre, Richard facilitated the city's fall to the Crusaders in 1191. To backtrack slightly, Richard's arrival at the siege of Acre had provided us the very first real insight into the nature of the relationship between himself and his rival warring leader Saladin. Within mere days of arriving at the scene of the siege, Richard sent an envoy to Saladin, requesting a meeting, and moreover the exchanging of gifts, this being the custom of kings when they happened to be near one another. Saladin perhaps unsurprisingly declined this offer, noting that it is not customary for kings to meet unless they have previously laid the foundations of a treaty, for after they have spoken together and given one another the tokens of mutual confidence that are natural in such circumstances, it is not seemly for them to make war upon one another. It should be noted that these precise quotations have survived down to us thanks to the biographer and close confidant of Saladin, Baha al-Din. Interestingly, some way into the siege of Acre, Richard would fall very ill, resulting in messengers and negotiators from Saladin delivering him fresh fruit and ice. To return to earlier themes explored, our previously posed juxtaposition between the nature of modern total, much less holy war, and the strange example set by our medieval forebears, the disparity is almost jarring. Why would one seek to prolong the life, to say nothing of the quality of life therein, of a rival military leader? With stakes as high as preserving God's holiest shrines and man's most spiritually significant relics, the presence of legitimate chivalry stands out all the more starkly. But to return to the game he was so clearly playing with these messengers and requests, Richard was testing the waters, perhaps even toying somewhat with his adversary. And as would later be even better exemplified by his behavior and eternally pondered by posterity, the earnestness of Richard's entreaties is unclear to us. He would eventually offer the hand of his own sister Joan in marriage to Saladin's brother, Al-Adil, a proposition unlikely to have been made in perfect faith, yet one strange enough to slightly defy cynicism or mockery. Richard, for all his well-earned reputation for violence, was incredibly shrewd and a masterful negotiator, something not lost on his Muslim opposites, who, from the pen of historian and advisor to Saladin, Imad al-Din, would write, "See the cunning of this accursed man. To obtain his own ends he would employ first force, and then smooth speaking, God alone could protect the Muslims against his wiles. We never had among our enemies a man bolder or more crafty than he. Each time that he concluded a pact, he broke it. Each time he gave his word, he wriggled out of it. Each time we told ourselves he will be true, he betrayed us. In any case, Saladin, possessing no shortage of shrewdness himself, suspected a ruse in Richard's marriage offer and immediately accepted it. Predictably, vacillation from the Christian camp immediately followed, culminating in a suggestion that Aladil convert to Christianity to facilitate the union. A complete non-starter, needless to say. It would seem prudent to take a moment now to more properly introduce Saladin's brother Aladil, known to the Crusaders as Saladin, as he served an incredibly paramount role as go-between for Saladin his brother and Richard the Lionheart. Saladin and Richard, perhaps surprisingly, never actually met face-to-face, and with the addition of translators, Aladil would be the man to actually engage in person with the English king. Referring to him as my friend and brother, Richard would enjoy seemingly very cordial meetings with Saladin, involving music, food, and gift and cultural exchanges. It isn't hard to envision Richard's relationship with the emissary of his supposed ideological enemy as far more relaxed and welcoming than that of his alleged friendship to fellow Christian kings, his supposed allies, such as the backbiting Philip of France. The aftermath of Acre's fall would now afford us another glimpse into the conduct and character of Richard the Lionheart, himself in possession now of scores of Muslim prisoners following their capitulation. In no insubstantial offer, Saladin had agreed to pay the Crusaders 200,000 dinars in currency, as well as to release all his own Christian prisoners, a sum of over 1,000 men by this point, and even to return the relic of the True Cross, seen here to fleetingly matter diplomatically. In return, Richard was to hand over the captured Muslim garrison unharmed. When Saladin was late in delivering the first installment of the ransom payment, a furious Richard marched all 2,700 members of the garrison out into the open beyond the city, well in view of Saladin's forces, and executed them to a man. Saladin unsurprisingly responded in kind by executing most of his own captives, but quite plainly, the brief truce, and all its attending agreements, were out the window. Even by the oft brutal standards of the age, this was something of a shocking act. Richard had up to this time garnered an impressive degree of respect among his Muslim adversaries, as he was correctly pegged as being a cut above his Christian military contemporaries, tactically, martially, and simply as a man. Whilst that admiration wasn't entirely undone by Richard's seemingly impulsive slaughter, Saladin's assessment of the man was unquestionably altered somewhat in the incident's wake. Richard, a man known to possess a flaring temper, with little patience for any delays in the prosecution of his war efforts, perhaps did act out of callous haste, and he may have suspected Saladin of causing duplicitous delay. We shouldn't be so quick to rule out a deeper, more nuanced motive on Richard's behalf, however. Something of a mental chess player himself, the perfect foil to Saladin, Richard may very well have acted as he did very calculatedly, in an effort to send Saladin a clear message, indicating refusal to be led by the nose diplomatically, a feigned public devaluation of understood Crusader war aims, or simply a stark unwillingness to suffer any stalling. We may never know his motive precisely. Richard did have fairly excellent reason to fear remaining in the Holy Land any longer than absolutely necessary. While settling quite naturally into his role as warrior king, and instantly demonstrating his indispensability to the Crusader effort, most Crusaders pledging themselves to service in the Holy Land were ultimately interested in doing their bit and beginning the long journey home. Even more pressing than departing manpower for Richard, however, was that his regional Christian rival, Philip II of France, had decided the time had already come for his return to Europe, citing his fulfilled crusading vows and ill health, leaving Richard deeply unsettled as he contemplated all the havoc Philip could and would wreak in his absence, a situation made all the worse by Richard's conniving brother John, who plotted against the Lionheart during his long stint away. In spite of his treachery, John would succeed Richard as king following the latter's death in 1199. Tempting as a response to these threats must have been, Richard wasn't prepared to step away, clearly feeling at home in this wild playground of zealous martial bravery, and he redoubled his commitment to retake the Holy Land. In September of 1191, the only major battle fought between the forces of Richard and those of Saladin played out in the Battle of Arsuf. A massively dominating win for the Crusaders, Saladin would never again commit his forces to open battle with Richard's armies. In August of 1192, Richard successfully repulsed an attempt by Saladin to completely seize the port town of Jaffa, a location which had already changed hands a few times between the Muslims and the Franks. With a surprise invasion having led to the town's fall into Muslim hands, the town's citadel remained under the control of the Latins, managing to hold out long enough for relieving Christian amphibious landing by sea, which successfully drove Saladin's forces out. This battle's outcome led directly to the peace agreement that would effectively close the crusade. Reckoning with internal strife and discontent, financial difficulties, and now overstretched and under-equipped, Saladin's capacity to wage war was rapidly dwindling to nil. The writing was very much on the wall. In perhaps the last notable example of the conflict's incongruous chivalry, upon noticing the Lionheart's wounded horse during the fighting in Jaffa, Saladin, also present at the battle, sent him a fresh mount. Perhaps most surprising of all in the scope of Richard's service in the Third Crusade, from a tactical standpoint, was his failure to complete a march on Jerusalem, thus completing a much-desired reconquest that was in no small measure the dominant motivation for even beginning the crusade in the first place. Richard, having received alarming news of Philip's shifty territorial misdeeds closer to home, was now fairly eager to return and see to his overdue domestic affairs. Squabbling amongst the Christians at this seemingly penultimate time also served to greatly undermine the war effort. Perhaps above all, however, Richard realized he lacked adequate regional power and support to successfully take Jerusalem, and have any remote hope of holding it, even against the greatly depleted Saladin. 2 abortive marches against Jerusalem were the last gasp of the Crusader war machine, however disappointingly for Europe. Saladin and Richard, still sharing no small degree of mutual respect, were in constant communication at this time, hammering out the conflict's final peace. Finally, on September 2, 1192, the 2 leaders entered into a 3-year peace agreement. Known as the Treaty of Jaffa, the Christians would remain unfulfilled in their ambition to rule Jerusalem, but would be allowed free access to the city, whilst entering as unarmed pilgrims or merchants. Notably, the Christians would retain sovereignty over the Levantine coast from Tyre to Jaffa, allowing for the persistence of a considerable Latin presence in the region. The proverbial hole in the Christian heart that was Jerusalem would sadly not be filled so easily, and more crusades would be to follow. Richard at last left the Holy Land on October 2, 1192. He would experience his own strange parody of the travails of Odysseus, forced to travel overland following a shipwreck, and captured by a bitter, slighted former ally, Leopold V of Austria, who handed Richard over to Holy Roman Emperor Henry VI, who would keep him in prison for over a year, until a massive ransom payment at last secured his liberty. Richard, likely unsurprisingly, would spend much of his remaining reign feuding with the contentious Philip II of France. With neither Christian nor Muslim objectives fully met by the outcome of the Third Crusade, and with only more numbered crusades to come, to call the preceding narrative's events inconclusive would feel like colossal understatement. If the Crusaders faced criticism from European Christendom for failing to take what they'd come for, the Muslim world was equally, if not more, appalled by their military's inability to fully rid the Franks from their domains. Future strife was utterly inevitable. Perhaps, then, the most enduring legacy of this crusade, only the third among several after all, is nothing military, theological, or geographical at all. Surely, those are simply all shared aspects present in many of our global conflicts today. What isn't present today, and what reaches forth so strikingly from the pages of history chronicling this era, is the spirit of a bygone age that to us is so completely antiquated, so utterly baffling, and so seemingly entirely at cross purposes with itself. To set the world ablaze in the name of fundamentalist jihad, whether Christian or Muslim in origin, only to then adhere to a rigid code of formal chivalrous conduct. To meticulously smite unbelievers, all the whilst playing grand strategic gentleman's chess with your highly regarded opposite. To set forth on a zero-sum, all-or-nothing crusade, only to amicably come to terms that go to some lengths to appease all those involved. Perhaps it's more noble. Perhaps it's more foolish. At the very least, it's certainly fascinating. I'm Cam, and this has been Resonant Time.